today's mindful moment, packed with insights but designed to fit into your busy life. One deep dive at a time. Have you ever thought that history is less like, a neat timeline and more like a tangled up ball of yarn? We think we get what happened, but then you pull on one thread and oh boy, a whole new view pops up. And that's exactly what we are diving into today. Hannah Arendt. The Origins of Totalitarianism. It's a thick one. Yeah, real brain twister. But it just might change how you think about, the 20th century, and maybe even how we look at our own times.
Tangled ball of yarn, that's a great way to put it. You know what makes Arendt's work so powerful? She wrote it in 1948, like just a few years after Nazi Germany fell apart. It was fresh, She really needed to understand how something so awful could have happened, not just as like a one-time thing, but as something that grew out of forces that were already in motion.
So get ready, listeners, because we're going to unpack some of those forces. We'll be going from what seemed like a pretty stable 19th century right into the heart of totalitarianism. And it's not just about, specific regimes like Nazi Germany or Stalin's Russia. It's about understanding the underlying things that made such regimes possible in the first place.
And one of those things, and this is where Arendt really gets you thinking, is the very structure of the nation state. Now, we usually think of the nation state as a sign of progress, of unity, right? But Arendt, she argues that it was actually the nation state's very nature, this balancing act between state power and being included in society, that created weaknesses that totalitarian movements took advantage of.
Okay, so the nation state isn't the good guy here. That's already a twist. But how did it create this weakness? I mean, wasn't it supposed to protect its citizens?
You would think so, right? But Arendt's argument is that the nation state often created a kind of acceptance, a conditional acceptance, especially for minority groups. And she uses the example of Jews in Europe to illustrate this. Think about someone like Benjamin Disraeli, a Jewish man who became the Prime Minister of Great Britain. On the surface, it looks like a success story. But, as Arendt points out, even at the height of his power, Disraeli knew his position was shaky. He was always going to be the outsider.
So it's like he could play the game, but he couldn't really make the rules. And that feeling of not quite belonging, that wasn't just for people like Disraeli, was it?
Oh, absolutely not. Arendt brings up the Dreyfus affair in France. Remember that one? This huge scandal where a Jewish army officer was falsely accused of treason. It just ripped French society apart, didn't it? Exposed all the deep anti-Semitism simmering under the surface, even though the Republic was all about liberty and equality.
So it's trying to fit in, to become part of the nation state, actually brought out those hidden prejudices that were there all along.
Yeah.
And if I'm getting Arendt right, she's saying this wasn't just like an accident. It was baked into how the nation state worked.
Exactly. Arendt's point is that as the nation state got more powerful, it needed to decide who was useful and who wasn't. And, Jews often ended up as pawns in that game. Take Bismarck's Germany, for instance. He was perfectly happy to protect Jewish financiers when it helped him politically and, with the economy. But he was also happy to shut other Jews out of power.
So it's this chilling way of thinking that you're only good if you're useful to the state. And that really sets the stage for the kind of exclusionary ideologies that fuel totalitarian movements, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And Arendt doesn't stop there. She argues that the same logic is at work in the rise of other pan movements like pan-Slavism and pan-Germanism that we saw popping up in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These movements, fueled by, a kind of tribal nationalism, they offered this strong mix of ideology and belonging, especially for people who felt lost or resentful of the existing order.
So it's not just about being proud of your nation. It's about finding an identity, signing a purpose in a world that's becoming more uncertain and chaotic. And Arendt makes this interesting distinction between overseas imperialism and continental imperialism, right?
Yes. Arendt thought overseas imperialism was mostly about economics, like chasing new markets and resources. But continental imperialism, that was different. It was driven by this idea of expanding the nation itself, of creating a kind of cultural or racial empire built on exclusion and domination. Think of it as a sort of weaponized nostalgia, promising to bring back a mythical past where everyone belonged and knew their place.
That's a great point. These pan movements weren't just about taking land. They were about taking hearts and minds. And it's easy to see how that kind of thinking could be used by totalitarian leaders who promise to bring back order and greatness.
Exactly right. These movements really tapped into a deep need for unity and purpose. And as we'll see in the next part of our deep dive, that need can be a very powerful tool for those who want to control and manipulate.
We were just talking about how those pan movements tapped into this really deep need to belong, often by pushing others away. It's scary how easily that need can be used by, people who want to control others. But what about the individual under a totalitarian regime? When the state says it represents the will of the people, what happens to personal freedom? Or even just the idea of having rights at all?
Well, Arendt argues that totalitarian regimes, they actually try to destroy what she calls the juridical person in us. Think of it like this, the juridical person is the part of us that exists, legally protected by rights and laws. Totalitarianism wants to wipe that out completely, to turn us into nothing more than tools of the state.
Okay, so it's not just about shutting down people who disagree. It's about getting rid of the very idea that people have rights in the first place. But how do they even do that? It sounds almost impossible.
It's a kind of multi-pronged attack, really. First, they create categories of people who are outside the law's protection. Jews, political opponents, anyone they consider undesirable, really. They take away their citizenship, basically making them legally non-existent.
Yeah.
And they force the rest of the world to accept this lawlessness. Then they set up places like concentration camps that operate completely outside any legal framework. Places where, well, anything goes.
The concentration camps weren't a new thing, right?
Okay.
The British used them in the Boer War, didn't they? So what made the totalitarian use of them so different, so uniquely awful?
Arndt's argument is that totalitarian camps weren't just about punishing people or locking them up. They were designed to completely destroy the person, both physically and mentally. The goal was to break people down, take away their dignity, their identity, even their ability to think for themselves.
So it's like some kind of spiritual annihilation, reducing a human being to just an empty shell. And this connects to the idea of total terror that we touched on before, doesn't it? Not just terror aimed at specific enemies, but this constant, all-pervasive fear that gets into every part of life.
Exactly. It's about creating a society where you never know who to trust, where anything you say or do could be twisted against you, where even your own thoughts feel dangerous. It's this constant state of anxiety that paralyzes people, makes them afraid to speak up, to question, even to trust their own judgment.
So total terror isn't just about physical violence. It's a kind of psychological warfare, a way to break down people's resistance from within.
Precisely. And Arendt says this psychological manipulation is really effective because it leads to self-censorship. People start policing their own thoughts and actions, afraid to step out of line. They become, in a way, complicit in their own oppression.
It's a pretty chilling thought, actually, this invisible terror that seeps into everything. Turning neighbor against neighbor, even family member against family member.
Arendt argues that this atomization, this breaking down of social bonds and trust, is key for totalitarian control. It isolates people, makes them feel powerless and alone, and much more likely to submit to the state's authority.
Which makes it even harder to resist, of course. If you feel like you're the only one who sees what's happening, the only one questioning the story they're telling, it's easy to doubt yourself,
Yeah.
to give in to the pressure to conform.
It's a vicious cycle, absolutely. And it's one of the reasons totalitarian regimes can last for so long. The terror isn't just coming from the top down, it's coming from everywhere, from the very fabric of society itself.
So we've talked about how totalitarian regimes attack the individual, how they create this atmosphere of fear and paranoia. But what about the bigger picture? How do they actually hold on to power beyond just using brute force?
Well, Arendt argues it's not just about brute force. Totalitarian regimes really lean on ideology and propaganda to shape people's beliefs and how they act. They create these grand narratives that claim to explain everything, to offer a complete and total worldview.
Right, it's not just any ideology. It's an ideology that says it's found the ultimate truth, the key to understanding history and human destiny. And anyone who questions that truth is instantly labeled an enemy, a threat to the whole of society.
And Arendt makes a really interesting observation about these totalitarian ideologies. She says they're not really about explaining what is, they're about explaining what will be.
So it's about creating this utopian vision of the future, this perfect world that justifies any means necessary to get there.
Exactly. And the logic of these ideologies is often totally disconnected from reality. Facts and evidence, they don't really matter. What matters is the purity of the idea, the absolute belief in the ideology itself.
Which makes them incredibly dangerous because they can be used to justify literally anything.
Yeah.
If you believe you're on the right side of history, then any atrocity, any act of violence could be seen as a necessary step towards achieving that utopian ideal.
Arendt saw this firsthand with the Nazis. They truly believed they were creating a new world order, a thousand-year Reich where the Aryan race would rule. And that belief allowed them to commit horrific acts.
So how do these ideologies actually gain traction? How do they get people to buy into these often, crazy and fantastical claims?
That's where propaganda comes in. Totalitarian regimes, they're masters of propaganda. They control every form of communication: newspapers, radio, education, even art and culture. And they use these channels to constantly push their ideology, to shape how people see things and what they believe.
So it's like a nonstop barrage of messages, a kind of brainwashing meant to drown out any voices that disagree.
Ernst talks about the importance of repetition and simplification. Totalitarian propaganda, it takes complicated ideas and boils them down to simple slogans and images that are easy to remember and repeat. And they repeat these messages again and again until they become ingrained in people's minds.
It's a very clever kind of manipulation, and it's especially effective during times of crisis or uncertainty. When people are afraid, when they're looking for answers, they're more likely to grab onto these simple, all-encompassing explanations that totalitarian movements offer.
Exactly. These movements offer certainty and a sense of belonging in a world that feels increasingly chaotic and dangerous. They tell people, we have the answers, we know the way forward, we can restore order and meaning to your lives.
And they do this partly by creating enemies.
Right.
They need someone to blame for all the world's problems, someone to rally against.
Oh, absolutely. Enemies are essential in totalitarian ideology. They give people someone to hate, someone to fear, someone to unite against. And it can be anyone, really. Jews, intellectuals, capitalists, anyone who doesn't fit into their worldview.
So it's about creating this us versus them mentality, a sense of constant conflict and struggle.
Arendt argues that this never-ending state of emergency, this feeling that the nation is always under threat, is crucial for keeping totalitarian control. It justifies silencing dissent, restricting freedoms, concentrating power in the hands of a few.
It's a chillingly effective strategy.
Yeah.
A way to turn fear and paranoia into political power.
And it's something we need to be very aware of today as we see nationalist and populist movements on the rise all over the world. These movements often use the same tactics of scapegoating and fear-mongering that Arendt analyzes so brilliantly in the Origins of Totalitarianism.
It's a sobering reminder that the lessons of history, they never really disappear, do they? And we'll explore those lessons further in the final part of our deep dive. So we've been talking about how totalitarian regimes manipulate individuals and how they use ideology and propaganda to create this atmosphere of fear and make everyone conform. But I'm still kind of struggling on how they actually organize themselves. It seems so chaotic, like this whole system, total terror, constant upheaval, this blurring of the lines between the state and the movement. How does any of it actually function?
Yeah, that's a question that puzzled Arendt too. And it's really important to understand if you want to get how these regimes actually work. You see totalitarian regimes, they don't work like traditional dictatorships where the power is clear and it's hierarchical. Instead they create these parallel structures on purpose that exist alongside and often actually replace the traditional institutions of government. Think of it as like a shadow government operating in the background, but it's the one really pulling the strings.
Okay, so it's like a government within a government. But why would they duplicate everything? Wouldn't that just make things more confusing and inefficient?
Well, that's the whole point. Arendt says that this system where authority overlaps with constantly shifting hierarchies and responsibilities, that's essential for keeping totalitarian control. It creates an environment that's ambiguous where no one really knows who's in charge or what the rules are or who to hold accountable.
So it's like a shell game. You can never quite figure out where the power really is, and that makes it really hard to resist, right? Because how do you fight an enemy that's constantly changing shape? How do you even organize any opposition when you don't know who to target?
Exactly. And because these regimes often operate outside of the normal legal systems, they can do whatever they want. They can change the rules whenever it suits them, which makes it almost impossible to challenge them through the usual channels.
But wouldn't this kind of system eventually just collapse under its own weight? I mean, it seems so chaotic and unsustainable in the long run.
Arendt would probably say that that's the whole idea, this constant state of flux, this perpetual revolution. It's part of the totalitarian strategy. It stops any kind of stability from taking hold, any space for dissent or opposition to emerge. It keeps people off balance, constantly looking over their shoulder, too scared to even question what's going on.
That's like a pressure cooker that never lets off steam. But all of this makes me wonder, what's the end game here? What's the ultimate goal of all this manipulation and control?
That's a question Arendt really grapples with throughout the book, and her conclusion is pretty unsettling, to say the least. She argues that totalitarian regimes aren't just driven by a desire for power or wealth. They're driven by something much deeper and much more dangerous, the desire to actually reshape reality itself.
So it's not enough to just control what people do. They want to control what people think, their very perception of truth and reality.
Exactly. They want to create a whole new world, a new kind of human being based entirely on their ideology. And to do that, they have to get rid of anything that challenges their worldview, anything that contradicts their narrative.
Which explains the whole obsession with purity, right? They're always looking for enemies, for anyone who might contaminate their perfect system with ideas or beliefs that don't fit.
It's a terrifying way of thinking, and Arendt says this logic always leads to violence and extermination because if you truly believe that you have the absolute truth, then anyone who disagrees with you isn't just wrong, they're evil, they're a threat to the very existence of your world.
That's a pretty scary thought. But in the face of such a powerful and all-encompassing system of control, what hope is there for resistance? Is it even possible to fight back against something like that?
Even though she saw the horrors of totalitarianism firsthand, Arendt didn't think all hope was lost. She saw a glimmer of hope in the very thing that totalitarian regimes try to destroy: human spontaneity.
Human spontaneity. I'm not sure I get what you mean. What does that mean exactly?
It's the idea that humans are unpredictable by nature. We're not just cogs in a machine. We can choose freely. We can be creative. We can make unexpected choices that defy the totalitarian script.
So even when there's this huge pressure to conform, there's always a possibility that someone will stand up, speak out, refuse to play along.
And that act of defiance, even if it's small, it can have a ripple effect. It can inspire others to resist, to challenge the story they're being told, to reclaim their own humanity. Arendt believed that this capacity for spontaneous action, for breaking free from the totalitarian grip that was the ultimate weapon against tyranny.
That's really powerful. Actually, it's a good reminder that even in the darkest of times, even when everything seems lost, the human spirit can still flicker, and it's that flicker, that spark of defiance that gives us hope.
It really does, and I think that's one of the most important takeaways from Arndt's work. Totalitarianism is a real threat, a threat that's still with us today, but it's not unbeatable as long as there are people willing to think for themselves, to speak truth to power, to resist the temptation to conform and give in to fear. There's always hope.
Well, on that hopeful note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. We've explored the historical roots of totalitarianism, the psychological and social mechanisms of totalitarian control, and the terrifying logic that drives these regimes.
We've also talked about how important it is to understand these dangers and to stay vigilant in our own time. Just like Arndt said, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance.
What stood out to you most about Arendt's analysis? How do you think her insights apply to our world today? Head over to our website where you'll find a link to buy The Origins of Totalitarianism. It's a tough read, but it's one that will stick with you long after you've finished the last page. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss our next deep dive.
Thanks for joining us.